we've disconnected our financial system from our material system. 70% of silver production comes from refining out of China. The copper, lead and zinc that's mined in Peru and Chile is sent to China, and then a silver slag is taken out and sent to the ingot makers in Switzerland and Mexico. What the Chinese have done is put a dual licensing system. Only 44 of the companies in China are allowed to actually sell it, and only approved applicants can buy the silver. There's 8 ton of silver in an AI data center. There's 65 ton of copper in an AI data center. You can go through the list. It's like a guillotine. If the Chinese want to turn the whole thing off, they can turn it off.
Welcome back to the Blockspace Pod, brought to you by CleanSpark. The United States data center, energy, and defense sectors are facing a multi-trillion-dollar logistics problem that almost nobody is talking about, except for today's guest, Craig Tindale. And Mr. Tindale should know a thing or two about the problem because, as he admits on the podcast, he kind of helped create it. Mr. Tindale served as a liaison and consultant for Western firms that were looking to outsource manufacturing capacity to China during that transition that took place from roughly the 60s to the 2000s. As a result, China now controls 80 to 90% of all of the refining capacity for the critical minerals and metals that are absolutely essential for not just the AI boom, but also for energy systems across the United States and critical defense systems. In this podcast, we break down how this transition happened, how it was really allowed to happen is a better way to put it, and what it means for the current AI boom in the US, and how it might end up derailing deployments and popping the whole bubble altogether. This pod fuses a bunch of the topics that we talk about on the Blockspace Pod, from data centers to energy, and also has a big macro focus. I'm really excited to release this one to y'all. It's one of my favorite pods that I've done since joining Blockspace, so I hope y'all enjoy it as well. We'll be right back with the interview after a word from our sponsors. Craig Tindale, welcome to the Blockspace Podcast, sir. How you doing?
Very good. How are you?
Doing great. Really appreciate you hopping on. As I was saying before we started, I was tickled pink, as we say back in the South of the United States, once I saw you respond to my message, because I thought I was shouting into the void. And your critical Mineral Thesis is one of my favorite reads of last year, and I'm going to recommend it to all of our listeners. Please take a look at the show notes to find that thesis. Before we get into the thesis and a lot of the questions that I have for you for how it intersects with some of the things that we talk about here, could you give us some quick background on yourself?
I started out in business in the early 1980s. I think my first trip to China was 1981. If people wonder about offshoring and offshoring and outsourcing, I'm guilty as charged. I literally represented American companies 95% of the time into Asia and set up a lot of the offshoring and set up a lot of the outsourcing for major, US corporations and Australian corporations. So literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of trips. I would go Bangkok, Singapore, KL, Beijing, back to KL. I would go round and round in circles, learning the locals. And as a result, I made a lot of contacts with people when they were very young, and they've become very important people these days. And so I was young and they were young, and we had a different world and we had a different philosophy about the world. And so, I just went about my merry way doing the things that I needed to do. So in a scalable sense, I talked to telecommunications companies, software companies, hardware companies, banks, central banks. I've introduced central banking systems into 2 central banks in Asia, including the Australian one. I worked for Oracle in 1987. I worked for IBM and I should have kept the shares. I worked for IBM in the early 1990s. And what my job was to do was to understand problems and I guess turn them into solutions. So understand, these were the days when computers were almost just invented. And so what we would do is, installing a mainframe into KL was a significant, challenging task in 1986. Installing a a database system into a major bank was a significant challenge. We had to understand their processes. We had to match their processes with their, their old filing cabinets, so to speak. We had to create a transition from, a paper-based system into a digital system. And so I sat with all that and went through all the iterations of it, for decades and decades and decades, it seems like, and it is. And so I gained a granular understanding of how the world worked because, I was literally immersed in it every day. We spent, inordinate amount of times in import-export businesses, understanding how things came and went from the Philippines, building import-export systems for major ports. We looked at banking systems and lending systems, and with the central bank's treasury systems, we had to understand how a central bank worked in order to create the supporting systems that they would require. And so where a lot of my work comes from is that granular understanding. It's listening to the world that we live in these days and kind of being frustrated because I keep going to myself, no, that's not how it works. That's not how the world works. And we're moving into a period of rivalry and risk. And that rivalry and risk, has happened before in history. And so what I bring to the table is that granular understanding. I could literally draw up on a whiteboard, how a bank works. All its systems, its lending systems, its treasury systems, its accounting systems, its data systems, literally everything. I left IBM in, I think, 2017. So I've been at it quite recently, and I've still got a lot of contacts in the system. And, I then went into keynote speaking right across the world. I used to do the after dinner talk with CEOs, CFOs, CIOs at conferences, and used to tell them things that they didn't know. That was my favorite kind of thing. Tell a bunch of CEOs things that they didn't know that they say to themselves they should have known, and had a lot of fun doing that. Then COVID came, and I found myself sitting on a laptop 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 hours a day instead of traveling around the world. And so I think I lasted a week. I shorted the market too. I got a big investment pedigree. When COVID came, made enough money to retire in about 3 weeks. And so, that's what I've been at for a long while. I've got a big 200-acre rainforest in northwest Sydney. It's probably the biggest forest in northwest Sydney, old growth. I basically sell my property and trade. And I guess what I'm concerned about is I've come out of my box because, hey, we face real peril. It's not just the peril of, a USD falling apart and it's relying on gold or Bitcoin or silver, which, is sound money. It goes beyond that. And the reality is we've disconnected our financial system from our material system. Our material system is no longer operational. I lived through the process, the neoclassical economic rationalism that said, we shouldn't produce anything anymore. We don't need to do that. We can produce things overseas much more cheaply, and so efficiency should be the guiding hand of our decisions. Now, that's got a long tail on it. It works for a while. But once you've got rid of all of your ability to produce things, you're like a turtle on your back. And that's happened in history before. The reality is that what's happened with us with China, with all this outsourcing, is that midstream metals, the metals that get processed, are all being done by China. If you take any 23 of the critical metals I mentioned in that report,
Wait, Craig, so can we back up for just 1 second before
Yep.
we dive? Because I want to share the report on screen really quickly, because this was going to be my
Yep.
next question, is for you to dive into this thesis, which, going back to your tenure involved in this offshoring, you've been not just in the maw of the Leviathan, but down into the belly and into the entrails, it seems. So, I was wondering, as I read your thesis and some of your work, how the hell does this guy index and know all of this stuff? And that was really helpful for me to have that background, because that's some real ethos behind what you're putting out here. So give us a rundown of some of I know it's a very long article. I recommend everyone read it. Give us a quick rundown of the general thesis and some of the pain points and most critical points of this, refining deficit that you lay out here.
Okay, so what's happened is it happens in a number of layers. Okay, and we'll talk about the refining capability through price weaponization. The Chinese have seized control of 50 to 98% of the critical metals, depending on which one you're talking about. Copper's around 50%. I think gallium is up at 98%. Titanium is up at 90%, etc. So, what does that in effect mean? It means that a mine in Tasmania that mines tin has an offtake agreement to sell that tin to a smelter in China. That is a contracted relationship. That means that nobody can get tin unless they get it from China, because they have the offtake agreement and they also have the smelting arrangement, and we have no capacity in the West to do anything about that. So we've settled for that type of system. Now, if you look at that that tin mine in Tasmania, is one example I'm talking about. It's half owned by a company called Yannon and another company called Metals X. Now, Metals X is an Australian listed ASX company. Yannon is a private Chinese or state controlled mining company. So we've got 50-50 at that stage. The offtake is going to China and it's going to the smelter, right? So we have no control of that tin loop. We've given up control of that tin loop. So if somebody wants tin, they have to go to China. Now, if you multiply that across all 23 critical metals and chemicals, we are beholden to China for every one of them. And it's a different arrangement in every situation. For instance, lithium, Pilbara Metals, the metals company, I think they do about 150,000 tons of lithium out of the Pilbara. They have an offtake agreement with Ganfeng that takes 80% of the existing metal lithium out of that mine, and it goes to China to process. So you've got the offtake agreement and you've got the processing, and we've lost our ability to process things. Not just in, we haven't got any processing capability. We've lost the skills to know how to do it as well. So, we've outsourced those things, and we're like I said, a turtle on our back. Now, if you go, I'll give you an example of silver, because I think this is the whole theory, because it is a complex document. The whole theory is best illustrated by, examples. Silver is really interesting. 70% of silver production comes from copper and lead and zinc refining out of China. The copper, lead, and zinc that's mined in Peru and Chile is sent to China and processed, and then a silver slag is taken out and sent to the ingot makers in Switzerland and Mexico. So what the Chinese have done is put a dual licensing system. Only 44 of the companies in China are allowed to actually sell it, and only approved applicants can buy the silver. That's for now. That was as of the 1st of January. It's like a guillotine. If the Chinese want to turn the whole thing off, they can turn it off. If they turn that off, we've already got a 4,600 ton deficit of silver in the West anyway. Now that's another 5,000 ton that if we took it out, we've racked up a 25,000 ton deficit of silver over the last 4 years. That means that we've gone into the vaults and pulled out 25,000 tons in 4 years. Now, obviously, that's a limited term option. What happens after that? What happens if China decides that they don't want to give us any more silver? It gets really interesting after that, because there's 8 ton of silver in an AI data center. There's 65 ton of copper in an AI data center. You can go through the list. There's going to be those hyperscale data centers. There's going to be 20 of them worldwide, right? So we have a lot of silver demand. Robots, we have gallium. We have to build magnets. The new PV, the more silver you put into a solar cell, the more efficient it uses. About every solar panel uses about 20 grams of silver. We have an exponential demand for silver. And, there's about 50 grams of silver in some of our most sophisticated missiles. It's right through our defense infrastructure, this demand for silver. Now, all of a sudden, they close it off. We've got 30% of the silver that's being produced left over. Where is the silver price going to go? It's going to go to a point where, there's likely to be state intervention, because at the end of the day, do you want to have a free market in silver, or do you want to be able to defend yourself? Do you want to build the AI data centers, or do you want to be able to defend yourself? Do you want to build PV, and solar panels, or do you want to be able to defend yourself? There'll be a pecking order, whatever that turns out to be. I don't pretend to know what that is. Elon Musk made the point the other day, it's very bad that silver is going up in price, because he's putting it in everything, because there's no replacement capability. So this happened. Go on.
Well, yeah, sorry. I just, there are so many things I want to pluck out for a second. It just to sidebar one thing really quickly. I want to return to the game theory of China turning off the tap, and also game theory of how they subsidize some of these critical minerals to undercut producers in the West. But I want to just ask, zooming in on silver for a second here, what are some of the other minerals that you highlight in this post that you think are the most vulnerable to this dynamic with regards to the AI, HPC, hyperscaler sector, and also energy systems? Which are the ones that you believe are kind of under the most pressure for those operators?
Well, heavy rare earths in particular. So everything that's used in magnets and everything's used in chip manufacture, etc. Virtually all of them. Tin. Tin is the kind of soldering tin is essential in everything. It's all being processed in China. We don't think of tin as a critical metal, but it's very critical, because it's basically the circuitry that puts everything together. And, we previously described the offtake agreements and the monopoly they have on that. It happens right across everything. This isn't just a partial, geez, we've got some exposure in copper or silver. We've got exposure in nearly everything you can think of. And it's not nearly everything you can think of. It is everything you can think of. So, this idea that we're going to build robot armies and that we're going to build energy systems, people do a lot of discussion about energy systems. There's a 4 or 5 year wait on a Siemens transformer, like one of the large transformers. They've literally got 138 billion euro backlog of orders. We're not going to. There's already data centers that have been built that we can't power. Now that Siemens can't provide the end product, and guess what? Where do they get their rare earths to build these transformers? China. So Europe's in exactly the same position. Japan's in exactly the same position. Titanium, is I think somebody else, an F-35 is 25% titanium. If you can't build titanium, you can't fix your planes. If you can't produce titanium, you can't produce your planes. 90% of titanium comes from, guess where? Russia and China. So the reality is that we could easily be disconnected, our financial system. We might be liquid. We might have a Fed that's willing to print as much money as they want, QE, that whole thing, but we may not be able to buy the materials to do what we need to do in any way, shape, or form, unless we acquiesce to Chinese demands. It's a situation where we're cornered. They've spent, I think Scott Bessent said the other day, they've spent 25 years building this plan against us, with the long fabled planning cycle of the Chinese strategists. And that's exactly what they've done. They've strategized us out of our supply chain. If this was World War II, you'd be sitting there and you wouldn't be able to supply any of your munitions, your aeroplanes, or your ability to fight the war. And there's a book called Unrestricted Warfare. It sits on my bedside table for years, and it was written by two Chinese generals, so I can't pronounce their names. And they outline how warfare is continuous and is not just kinetic. You know how generals fight the old war, and that's a saying. The old war we're fighting is a kinetic war that we imagine in, Hollywood movies. That we're running up against machine gun nests and we're dropping bombs on people. And the reality is they've got a long way ahead of us, and we're fighting the old war. We're building old kinetic war systems, and they've knocked off the supply chain. They've guillotined the supply chain from us building those systems. Hidden in plain sight. They didn't pretend not to do it. One of the arguments I get against me is, we did it to ourselves. Yes, we did it to ourselves. We did it to ourselves.
We are CleanSpark, America's Bitcoin miner, a publicly traded company with the largest operating hash rate, powered entirely by self-operated infrastructure across 4 states. This is our proof of work. We are setting the standard for what's next. Learn more about the intersection of energy and Bitcoin at cleanspark.com.
On the note of the guillotine that the Chinese are dangling over, this critical supply chain, when we look at the game theory of, so they're starting these export controls, not just on silver, but on a number of these rare earths. In your opinion, and this is kind of a 2-part question, how much wiggle room do they have for both subsidizing their own exports of these things below market costs so that they can undercut Western producers? And on the other end, let's say they do decide to cut it off. Is that sustainable without pressing them into a recessionary spiral? And is that why BRICS is so important? I know there's a lot going on there. So,
well, let's start off with the capital issue. Chinese capital comes without ESG. It comes without the cost of borrowing's lower because it's state capital. The risk premium is also missing. So, Chinese companies can borrow between 2% and 4%. American companies and Australian companies, mining companies or industrial companies, are basically looking at a WACC, or your weighted average cost of capital, of 15 to 20%. So, a Chinese company that returns 10% can do a lot better than an Australian or American company that's returning 20%. So we're outcompeted. And because they're willing to provide that cheap capital, and we don't, because it's hard for mining companies and industrial companies to get capital. Then our companies naturally go, well, okay, we'll have to take the Chinese capital. Fortescue, FMG, the big iron ore mining company in Australia, is borrowing off the Chinese state at the moment. They're also importing Chinese machinery as a pro quo, and they're also accepting CNY as payment. Now, if you talk about BRICS, let's think about this scenario. If they say to us at some point for these 23 chemicals and metals, we're only going to accept CNY as payment for these, then, the US dollar, the euro dollar especially, becomes absolutely useless because European companies can't get the finance to buy anything because the Chinese are asking for their own currency or gold. And so what you happen is you get a natural transition point to a CNY reserve. But, the irony will be that, you may, because of the debt load that the USD carries, you may have demand for the USD to pay debt at the same time, so that you may not get a loss of value, but at the same time, you won't be able to buy anything with it other than pay the debt. So you end up with this conversion paradox that you're trying to, you have to gain CNY to buy commodities because they control the commodities. You've got to get USD to pay your debts. And so you get a disconnection between the financial economy and the physical economy. And, we use the example of 16th century Spain. Spain went to the Americas and got all the gold. We all know that. They came back with hordes of gold, from the conquistadors and the Aztecs and the Mayans, etc. And they brought back all the gold to Spain, and they got lazy. They stopped manufacturing things. They stopped building things. They just lived off the gold. It's kind of similar to where we are today. And the reality is that eventually their gold couldn't buy anything, and they collapsed 3 or 4 times. Their empire collapsed because they couldn't produce anything. And so gold, real money wasn't real money. Like if you read the histories, the gold's been through its hard times as well. And so real money only works if it's connected to, connected to the material universe, it's connected to atoms.
Connected to real productivity. I think this is an important point. Sorry, if we could zoom in on it for a second, because in one of your recent posts or writings, you kept hearkening back to Alexander Hamilton, I believe, and his comments during the revolution and after the revolution in terms of it's critical to keep industrial capacity onshore to make sure that a state can stay sovereign. The financial games can't take you that far. And you've made the point that, we Bitcoiners and Austrian types, right? I mean, Bitcoiners were born of gold bug fathers. Like I have a gold bug dad. Shout out to Mike Harper. But, ultimately, we think that if you fix the money, make it sound again, this could help solve the issue. But you've said we need to pump the brakes on that.
Yeah, so let's talk about some of the theoretical frameworks of economics and where they were developed. Okay, neoclassical, Austrian, MMT have all been developed by dominant players, the empires, where there wasn't contention, there wasn't rivalry, there was a system basically that allowed them to be sure that they could achieve or acquire anything they wanted. The Hamiltonian logic, Alexander Hamilton, his logic was forged at Valley Forge, literally. He was Washington's assistant. He's 2IC. And he had to procure all the materials to fight the war. So he came out with his ideas were developed when he came out of a situation where the materials would allow him to fight a war. And so he said in the Federalist Papers, liberty and freedom were founded on the ability to manufacture. He has a beautiful document that was written in, I think, 1791. And in 1791, he wrote an essay on manufacturing and basically said that without manufacturing, you wouldn't be able to achieve freedom and liberty. And so the Republic has forgotten that. They've remembered the freedom and liberty bit. They've remembered the free speech bit. That's easy to remember, and they defend that. But they didn't remember the conditions precedent. They didn't remember what Hamilton said about manufacturing and the ability to, if you're relying on foreign powers for your stuff, you can't survive as an independent nation. You can't have freedom because you're a vassal of another state. And that was one of the things that he emphasized again and again and again. The Hamiltonian monetary system sits, I guess, below the Mises, the von Mises and the Hayeks and the Austrians, because they all assume that supply is achieved and they are dominant. What sits below that is Hamilton fighting the English at Valley Forge, going, I can't rely on anything. I have to make sure that I'm self-reliant. And he learnt that lesson. So, we're all subject to our own conditional influences. And so what you see is in philosophy, conditional influences, I guess, producing the output. So the Austrians, assumed that they were in a dominant situation. And so they could go for efficiency. Now, that doesn't dismiss the Austrian ideas of, balanced budget and sound money and all those kind of things. They're a given as well. There's a pecking order, The Keynesian system is exactly the same. So we're in a system that doesn't suit our what we line up for in our freedom and liberty. We've built a system that won't support that. And we've built it through, the Federal Reserve, etc., through a crazy system of economics and economic theory that says that, everything is obtainable at the right price. Well, no, it's not. Not if you're, not if your rival decides they're not going to give it to you and you're giving them all the power.
I love the framing of these dominant economic philosophies basically representing empires or states at their peaks, in the sense of this is part of the reason why they ascended to the top of the food chain for the economic thought or for the economic philosophers of their time, right? They're reflections of the states in which they were conceived. The other thing too, and this will lead into my next question, when I look back at policy blunders, or perhaps I should say erroneous worldviews that got us to this point, you think of the 1990s, and you mentioned this in your essay, the end of history theory, right? The Soviet Union falls, the US is the dominant superpower. There's this feeling, at least in the US, and I grew up, I was born in the 90s and I was in the 2000s, kind of still with some of that optimism, though no doubt the 9/11 and the wars in the Middle East dashed it pretty quickly. But there was this sense that we were entering a new phase in history, and coinciding with this hubris, I think, was this completely fatal idea that we could liberalize China. If we just invested in enough business and enough foreign policy in China, we could make it a liberal democracy. And I can't help but wonder if that's part of the reason why we abdicated so much material influence to that country. But that then brings me to my next question. Obviously, tariffs, whether or not effectual, are part of the policy calculus to try to correct this. What else do you see on the policy front happening at all, if anything?
Well, you can see, the DOD, or I think they call it the Department of War now. You can see the Department of Energy. You can see there's a capital department as well. They're starting to, I guess, finance these things directly. You saw it in MP Minerals the other day when they took 10% of the equity for, I forget how much, I thought it was 100 million or something like that. I can't remember. The reality is there's a kaleidoscope of those kind of things happening. I'm tracking about 15 or 20 of them. But they take time to happen. I can give you some examples if you'd like, but For instance,
Please do.
titanium. There's a company called IPX. Australians are very good at jumping on these types of opportunities. Those guys have built a new type of titanium processing technology called HAMR or HAMR. And basically what that does is takes the old Kroll process, which is the titanium process that's existed for basically, I think it's about 80 to 100 years. And they've changed it. And instead of, and it's come out, it's technology, it's innovation, it's classic American innovation. It's come out of the University of Utah. I came across it because one of my sons was going to the University of Utah, and he was on the ski team. And I visited him, and then I started reading about the University of Utah. And there's a guy called Zach Fang in the University of Utah who invented this new process that basically uses hydrogen to create the titanium powders that we need to do. Now, DoD have provided IperionX with the money to take that forward, and I think they're going to do about 1,200 ton of production for titanium, in the middle of 2026. They've also had funded the feasibility study in Tennessee. That's in Virginia. That processing center for titanium. They've also been given another. They've got a Titan project in Tennessee that basically is heavy rare earths and titanium and a bunch of other stuff. Now they're accelerating that with DoD or DOW money. Okay, there's another one out of Rice University. James Tour, that's the guy, has invented, and his team have invented a thing called flash Joule heating. Now, flash Joule heating is an incredible invention. Basically, what you do is if you get a ton of e-waste and you heat it up to 3,000 degrees and mix it with chlorine, you get a metal chloride out the other end, and you can separate the metal chlorides into individual lots. So, out of a ton of e-waste, you can get half a kilo of gold, right? You can let's even go lower. The coal ash, the fly ash that comes out of coal-fired power plants that's been built up over 100 years. Do you know out of every ton of coal ash, there's about 6 kilos of titanium. So, what we've been doing while we've been focused on innovation of attention deficit solutions like, Facebook and all those kind of things, while we've focused on them as the core of our innovation, these poor, very hardworking scientists who should be the forefront rather than Steve Jobs and Zuckerberg have been inventing stuff that just couldn't get off the ground because they couldn't, we go back to the way that the average cost of capital. They couldn't get these projects off the ground because no one wanted to know about building material things. And these kind of things are coming to the fore now. There's a huge amount of innovation, and that's one of the solutions out of this. This coming to the fore. There's a company, UCU or UCOR, that's just gone from pilot plant to its first commercial production. They've reinvented heavy rare earth processing. So instead of putting on massive lakes that pollute, they've got a vertical, self-contained, closed-loop system. So if you could imagine, it's turned a rare earth refining factory from being a huge lake and these separation tools into basically what looks like a plumber's nightmare inside a factory that gives no pollution, is completely self-contained. Now I think they go into commercial production. I think they just announced it yesterday. And so you've got, and they're DOD. They've been DOD funded for about 12 months, 24 months.
It seems to me like there's just going to be, to address this, a perfect fusion of the public and private. not a perfect fusion, I shouldn't say, but the public will have to be working very closely with private entities to solve this problem because, as you said, it's a national security risk. Almost in the same way that you might see kind of an executive order 6102 for silver or something like that in the future, not because we need it for war funding, because we need it to actually build the missiles and build the defense systems.
That's exactly what we need.
It's hard to extrapolate out, but I guess my question is, these innovations seem like really good stopgaps for now to try to, or maybe to complicate a metaphor here, kind of like the Dutch boy with his finger in the dam. It might hold it for a little bit, but it won't necessarily totally solve it. What's the timeline for actually reshoring some of this stuff? And actually, what companies are really looking at building the refining capacity as well as all the other downstream refining industrial processes you need in the West?
I think you've got every producer in the world looking at refining capacity and options. You know, we've just had an announcement of Rio Tinto and Glencore discussing a merger. You know who the only refining capacity out of those two is? Vale out of Brazil, right? So I wouldn't be surprised if they put them all together. Now the British are talking about that being a competition issue. I would put it to them it's a survival issue. If these companies don't merge and share their capacities, the ability to build refining capacity is obviously long-term industrial development. You can't build it in a year. A lot of these projects I was talking about have already been going 3 or 4 years, right? They're only just getting to production stage now. So we have a gap. We have a gap where we will be beholden to the Chinese, and they could just say, well, no, we're not going to let you produce any more defense capability. Sorry, you can't build any more F-35s. We're in that gap now, and that provides motivation or it's a worrying factor, because if you're in the old terms of kinetic war strategy, do you wait until the other guy catches up, or do you go earlier than they're comfortable? And that's what happened in World War One. Where they had the zinc. I think we talked about it. Is the Lloyd George had to become Minister for Munitions because in 1915, because in 1914 France lost because it couldn't provide the metals for their artillery shells. In the Battle of Orgurs in 1914 and 1915, the German literally overrun the Allied lines because they couldn't provide munitions. And that was because a German company, Metallgesellschaft, I think is how you say it, was a global provider, a German global provider of metals. Now they did all there's analogies, this is analogous to where we are today. They did all the refining of zinc and copper and the creation of brass alloys and all the things that were key to the Allied defense. They did that in Germany. They had companies in North America, in the US and Australia, where they used to bring the mining ore from and refine it. So when they found themselves at the steps of World War One, the Allies had no supply lines for the metals they wanted. It kind of sounds like a rhyme somehow. It echoes we've done it again. And this is why we go back to the theoretical basis of all the schools of economics. They were all done when we were dominant. They weren't done. The only one that wasn't done when we were dominant is Hamilton, who had to survive, the Revolutionary War. And they learned Hamilton, if you read the Federalist Papers, wanted to put it in the Constitution, the ability to fund yourself with materials instead of relying on foreign suppliers, because he experienced that directly. We're all subsets of what we experience. And we've got it in the Federal Reserve at the moment. That the Federal Reserve puts up interest rates as soon as our bread and milk goes up, and that kills all our industrial projects and all our defense projects, because instead of 2%, instead of price inflation that they're worried about consumers, they're not worried about our industrial projects, and it kills them off. They're stillborn. And on top of that, you've got the Chinese running a price war at us in almost every category. How do you put a rare earths refiner in place if China constantly subsidizes rare earth processing or lithium or literally anything? If you pick anything in that report, any metal you can think of, it's covered.
Sorry, Craig, if I can just jump in one more time to ground this back into a question related to like data center and energy landscape. We're talking about all of these choke points that are turning now into bottlenecks. We have stories coming out of, disk shortages. Now you've got one of the fiber optics cables, a CEO of a fiber optics cable provider saying that the lead time might be as much as a year for these things. And that's like the critical networking component for these hyperscaler and AI data centers. It's becoming increasingly clear to me that the 2025, we'll say 2024 as well, but really 2025 CapEx boom really, how should we say, outran the actual available materials and inventory. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are on whether or not all of these dynamics could converge into the pin that pops this bubble.
Oh, definitely, because we've got a Fed that supports asset speculation. It doesn't measure inflation as asset price rises. If your bread and milk goes up, it's inflation. If the price of your house goes up by 3 or 4 times, it doesn't matter. Because what they do with the wealth effect is, people feel wealthier and they consume more, and it keeps the cycle going. So in this situation, it's exactly the same. You've got $400 trillion in financial market capitalization, and I don't know what the number is for industrial market and such, but it's much lower. And so we've prioritized through our economic system, through our monetary system, the wrong thing. So how does that translate to data centers? How does that translate to robots and PV and just about anything you can imagine? Is you're not going to be able to build these things. And if they find out that they can't build them, and they're going to find out pretty soon, right? Or they might not be able to build them because at the moment they're getting supplied, but that supply is under the risk of guillotine. Those capex will significantly reduce. And I would make the argument that all the capexes are overvalued anyway, because they're assuming supply of materials. They're assuming an environment, an economic environment that's going to be vastly different than the ones they're experiencing. So the cap, let's pick one. Microsoft is going to build all these data centers, or OpenAI. If they can't build the data centers, it doesn't matter how many chips they have. It doesn't matter if they can't power the data centers, if they can't get the transformers for the data centers, if they can't build the batteries, it's just not going to happen. And that is China's plan, is to block it. Why wouldn't they? Like, if you were playing from the Chinese side, then you assume this is a game of Risk. I just finished playing a game with my grandson. If you assume this is a game of Risk and you were playing on the Chinese side, why would you give it to us? There's no reason that you would give up your advantage. In fact, you would push your advantage. And so the whole economic system of the West is disconnected with its material reality.
You mentioned energy, and we haven't touched on it very much, but there is almost a catch-22 here, or the fact that energy systems are simultaneously competing for these components, and you need those components for the energy systems. Otherwise, you can't deliver power to the end customers of AI data centers, which also need these components. They seem to be cannibalizing each other. And I don't want to get too, as we call it, us younger folks, black-pilled on this. But one of my favorite charts to consult And it's not favored in the sense that like, oh, golly gee, that sure is swell. It's more like it makes me a little bit incensed every time I see it. But if you look at the US's electrical generating capacity, it surges from the 50s to the 2000s, or rather 2000, and then it just totally flatlines. And that's when we started decommissioning coal. So when we started plugging coal with intermittent renewables. And also for reasons I've still really failed to understand, other than propaganda and fear, nuclear also started dropping off. I know the answer already to this, but I have to ask it. What's the fix to that? That's quick. There just isn't any. You know, you just turn on old coal plants. I mean, what needs to be done?
You can't just turn all the coal plants. Let's look at. I've got another paper coming out on industrial accidents and in the US over the last 2 years. Okay, because I just got curious, right? I thought, geez, there seems to be a lot of fires. There's fires in aluminium plants. There's fires here. There's fires there. Why don't I collect them all up and make a list of them? And then I spent about 2 days reading in what was happening. And then I realized that some of these places were the last point of failure. There's an aluminium plant in New York that's had 3 fires in the last 6 months. And then, what did that turn into? That turned into Ford having to stop its production line. That's probably the best illustration I can give you. Is as soon as we ran out of aluminium, Ford had to stop its production line, and that focused everywhere. Like magnesium. I think it's called U.S. Magnesium. I could be wrong. U.S. Magnesium just went bankrupt. Magnesium is used for titanium production. We let them go bankrupt. Like it's the only magnesium producer in the United States, and it's being allowed to go bankrupt. Which wouldn't mean that 98% of our magnesium comes from China again. So how are you going to make titanium without magnesium? I've got no idea. So while there's things happening, the whole thing is in disarray. The plants are falling apart. There's ESG issues with getting plants commissioned. There's environmental issues. They get bogged down everything. So can we produce the chemicals that we need to produce to make all these metals? Like we're focused on metals. Like if you focus on chemicals, it's just as bad. And they're having fires too. And it's like, how many fires? Like we've got a skeleton infrastructure of what's left. And there keeps being industrial accidents that happen to, take the plant down, which means that we've got to rely on them again. It's atrophy. For instance, restarting an aluminium plant. I don't know if you've ever seen an aluminium plant. I saw one out when I was a kid. When you close those down, they kind of solidify, and you've got to literally take jackhammers to them to restart them. So as soon as you're in economic theory or in neoclassic economic theory, all that calculus they show you, right, is nonsense. It's, all that fancy calculus. It's not mathematics. It's not physics. It's models. It's computer models. And they're really bad computer models from 30, 40, 50 years ago by boffins that have no idea about the real world, right? So in the theories, right, and it's come out in my new paper on capital, they say, if you close down a plant, it doesn't really make much difference to the theorem, to the calculus. But it might take you 2 or 3 years to restart that plant. You may not have the skills to do it anyway, because when you closed it down, they all went and did other things. They retired. They went to Florida. They did, all kinds of things. I think
that's the other really increasingly disconcerting part of this is the human capital. You retweeted it, something from Luke Groman today about apparently there's only like one guy in the U.S. who can make tubas anymore, or so. I have a hard time believing that. Maybe it's true.
I talk to Luke a lot.
But he basically, Luke Groman was saying this is a microcosm of the entire problem that we're dissecting here. It's actually something I think Tim Cook talked about a while ago with regards to manufacturing, people were always saying it is the labor cost that is the benefit with China. And he said, that's only part of the equation. The other part is that they have generations of knowledge now for how to run these things efficiently, how to stand up the factories. And we've totally abdicated that. Before I ask the closer, is there a silver lining here? No pun intended. What, if any, good thing can we glean from this?
That we're starting to know about it. There's no real good, we're living through. If you look at history, there's been some catastrophic times. And the reality is that we think we're at the end of history. We're insulated from it. And, we were telling everyone 5 years ago, learn to code. What a useless, in retrospect, what a useless bit of advice. If you can't get the computers, you can't do this. What's the code going to do for you? So we're entering your generation, my children's generation. Unfortunately, and I understand the frustration of young people because I've got 7 children and they're all young. And they talk to me about it, is that we lived through the good times and we burnt our bridges behind us. And the reality is you guys are going to have to rebuild these bridges, and you're going to have to start rebuilding them as soon as possible. There's no, the theories that we have of economic rationalism and all that kind of stuff were akin to a cult. They were akin to Scientology or something like that. They're moronic. The idea that we can have an economy that's just financialized and we can rely on our rivals for supplies, as Hamilton said, imperils any idea that we have of liberty and freedom and any of those quaint concepts, which they'll turn out to be quaint if we don't get a move on. I came out of my box because, I've got quite a nice life here. I don't have to really do anything. But, you're seeing all this and seeing, especially from a scalable point of view. I have to come out of my box and start telling people what the hell's going on and to wake up. And that it's rather than doomerism, it's wake the hell up, work out what you can do, stop learning to code, go and become an engineer or a geologist or something like that, do something useful, and stop listening to people my age because they've got no idea what they're talking about, most of them. It's a new age. It's a new time. Sound money's not going to do it. It's not going to even help. Bitcoin's not going to buy, lithium. It's not going to buy, the rare earths you're going to need to survive, nor is gold or silver. And that's nothing wrong with that. I own all three. But that's an investment case, not a survival case. And if we want to survive, we've got to get at it. Like I've got a place here and I'm totally off grid. I've got my own water. I've got food crops. I've got every damn thing I ever need forever. I said to Luke the other day, I could go and shut the gate and ignore everybody for 2 or 3 years, probably longer. I'm not sure. I got 90 solar panels. I got generators. I got all kinds of things. And it makes me sound like a prepper. But I don't think people have lived through this, and I don't think they imagine the hardships that are coming. And now it's just, wake up, become resilient, start looking at your options. When I grew up, people used to grow food in their backyard. I used to go out in the backyard and my grandfather would be growing tomatoes and be growing all kinds of things. And now we don't grow anything. We buy everything. No, sorry, you're not going to be able to do that. And then you've got the complicating factor of robotics. From an innovation perspective, Silicon Valley is just about to make human labor obsolete. We're the BlackBerry of human beings are the BlackBerry, and the iPhone is a robot. Now, if you haven't been convinced that you need to be more resilient because your incomes are going to fall, if robots do all the work, even if they can get the raw materials to build them, if robots do all the work, we'll all be on universal income trying to work out how to buy food. The reality is the future is stark. And we've been through this as human beings before. We've been through it right through our history. All of our ancestors have been through it. We're a tough stock, but we need to get moving now and start going, okay, this is the wake up call. This is the reality. And if we don't start doing something about it now, there's a lot of suffering. There's a Buddhist term of attachment. Attachment causes suffering. Our attachment to our ideas, our concepts of how the world works, is going to cause us a lot of suffering. And so what we need to do is start to think about how we make ourselves resilient, how to make a life for ourselves in this new world, because it's not going to be the same as it used to be.
Mr. Tindale throwing cold water on the Bitcoin fixes everything crowd. I like to see it. Craig, last
I love
question.
Bitcoin. I think it's a great idea, but
I agree with you. Yeah, I agree with you completely on that. Protecting your own savings through hard money is great, but at the end of the day, we're talking about not just the individual scale. We're talking about the collective scale for Western civilization in terms of actually being able to defend itself against not just kinetic, but other threats like subterfuge. Last question, and then we'll bounce here, Craig. Thank you so much for taking the time. So,
Pleasure.
The military action in Venezuela just kicked off. Now we're talking, or I shouldn't say the Trump administration is talking about trying to seize Greenland. It seems like I saw a tweet today where it's like, it almost seems like the table's being set for something bigger. Do you see any black swan events that could throw these into high gear? Like these dynamics that we're talking about into high gear?
Well, I think Trump's over a barrel. This is just my own take on it, right? I think Trump's over a barrel. He realizes where he is. He can't supply his own critical metals, and he's trying to find an equalizer. Now, 80% of the oil from Venezuela goes to China. 90% of the oil from Iran goes to China. And it all has to travel, even the Persian Gulf stuff has to travel through Hormuz. Now, if he can grab Iran and he can grab Venezuela, then that's the key supply line for China from an energy perspective. They can't make their own energy, right? They've certainly got a big stockpile of food and energy and things like that, but it might make them think twice. So the whole thing here is that we could go into all kinds of other things, but the whole thing is here that war is sometimes avoided by keeping the other party guessing, is to keep them relying on you and you're relying on them. There's other categories of that as well. For instance, there's some minerals that America produces that China doesn't produce. There's only a few of them. And so those minerals and some of the software that the Chinese use to build fabs and all that kind of stuff is also a reliance factor. So I interpret the current administration as trying to find equalizing issues in order to keep the Chinese from going into a kinetic war and cutting them off. It's an equalizing issue. Greenland is another one. If you're in Greenland, you own, I guess, the Arctic. You can't ship, to ship oil from Russia to China. You could basically stop it if you own Greenland and Canada. And I'm assuming Canada would play ball, so Greenland's the only factor. Now, they have a 2 million barrel per day from Russia to China pipeline, so they can get some oil, but the rest has to go by sea. So I think that's all the shenanigans that you're seeing with tankers and seizing and Venezuela and Iran and all that is the Trump administration is trying to equalize the playing board, go back to risk. It's trying to work out the moves that it needs to make to avoid war. I may have a wrong take on it, but it's certainly what I'd consider, because at the end of the day, we've got lots of great ideas about what's right and wrong from an international law perspective. But if you don't have your country and you can't defend it, well, international law is not worth much. And you've got to break those kind of constraints to protect the American people or the Western civilization. And that's my cut on that. I think we're in the early stages of a wall buildup, and what we're seeing can be interpreted through that lens.
And going back to what you were just saying with your what good is international law if your chief adversary is overfishing all across the world, basically trying to destroy maritime ecology or marine ecological systems, not to mention a number of other things that we won't get into right now. But Craig, I think that does it. We're at about an hour. Again, really appreciate you calling in and recording this with us today. Could you just give our listeners a shout to let them know where they can find you and your work?
Well, I'm on Twitter at Tindale. It's nice and easy, Ctindale, and it's Craig Tindale on Substack. All the essays are up on Substack. I think they're easy to read there, but Tindale, they're also in Twitter. Jump on board and send these essays around. Like your future literally depends on folks waking up to the peril that we face. And so if I could ask all your readers to send these around, we've had, Robert Friedland, who is probably the most influential mining entrepreneur of our generation or of several generations, reposted my stuff and said it was the best thing he'd ever read. We've got some really heavy hitters going, yes, this is right. This, they know what they're talking about. The owner of Ivanhoe Mines knows what he's talking about and says that what I've written is the best he's ever read. Then everyone should be listening and reading it and digesting it.
Craig, thank you so much. Have a good weekend. And for all of y'all tuned in, appreciate y'all. Thank you so much. We will see you next time.